Hello and welcome to our Profiles in Leadership series. We are very pleased today to have Gregory Mandel, who is the Provost of Temple University, Senior Vice President of Temple University, and the Peter J. Lycor Professor of Law. Welcome, Provost Mandel. I just want to start with a quote that really talks about your beginnings. And this was when you were appointed, and Joanne Epps, when she was interviewed, says that your ties to Philadelphia run deep, having grown up in the East Mount area. Why don't we start there and tell us about your childhood and your early education?
Well, thank you, Daryl, and thank you for welcoming me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Yeah, so I grew up mostly in Philadelphia. For elementary school, I went to a school, a very small progressive school here called Mequon, which was very committed to sort of individual and hands-on learning. And I think that some of those elements around the search for knowledge, encouraging exploration, encouraging creativity are pieces that probably continue to run through my education and then my professional experience and interests over time.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about the Mequon School, because I noticed from your bio that you are now currently also involved.
That's right. Although not involved at this moment. After I graduated from high school, I left the Philadelphia area for about 20 years when I went to college and worked in law school and some other pieces that we may discuss. But then I moved back for the job at Temple Law School, and we had two young kids then, and we're pleased to send both of them to Mequon. Again, it's nursery through sixth grade school. It has just about 150 students. And I ended up getting asked to serve, was pleased to serve on the board of the school, and ended up serving for 2 years as the president of the school as well.
What would you say
of the president of the board, just to be clear.
So no double employment, yes.
Right.
Now, what would you say was your biggest takeaway during your days there?
So my biggest takeaway
from your days at Mequon.
Oh, from when I was a kid?
Yes.
Yeah, I think as I said, that sort of encouragement to, a couple things, I guess. One is an encouragement to pursue your own interests.
Mm-hmm.
Support of learning through doing, support of creative thinking, and sort of new approach, trying different things out, being willing to explore and fail and figure out a path that works.
One of the things that you tried out was NASA and the Hubble telescope. So how did you stumble upon that?
Yeah, so jumping forward a little bit, I had during high school and college, I was a very science-oriented kid, science-oriented student. I ended up majoring in astronomy and physics. I got very interested in space and astrophysics during that time. But it was law had always been something that held a little bit of an interest as well. And I think there are actually some parallels between the fields around problem solving, around analytical rigor and precision. But in college, I focused on, as I said, astronomy and physics. Ended up doing a thesis on the formation of new stars. Particularly in a nebula that's in Orion's belt. And then after college, went on to work for a couple of years at NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. I always like to quickly mention, for those who remember the launch of the Hubble in 1990, when it went up, and it was quickly discovered that there was a problem with the mirror. I was hired in 1991 to help react to the problem with the mirror, so I didn't cause the problem. But I was in charge of a team that was taking the distorted images that were being received by the Hubble and figuring out how best we could reprocess them to identify what was causing the blurriness, how the blurriness was changing the images, and eventually they sent up and did a space mission and made a correction to it. But for the time I was there, we didn't have that correction, and so we were engaged with the images, and it was very exciting in working on them to be one of the first people to see these new images of the deepest galaxy that had ever been imaged before, or effectively the furthest back in time that we had ever seen before. To be involved in the scientific discovery process in that way was a real thrill. It was very exciting. I enjoyed the work. But as I said, I had also thought about law. I had taken a couple law-related courses in college. I had enjoyed them a lot, thinking about sort of how people deal with conflict in society, how they resolve conflict, how law is a very important part of how we order society, and so thinking about what approaches we could take in that regard. And so after I had been working at the Hubble Institute for a little while, I began to essentially decide between a career in astrophysics, going on to get a PhD and a career in that field, or going on to law school. And I decided on law school for a couple reasons. The primary one was that although I enjoyed the intellectual challenge of astronomy and physics, it did not feel as closely related to humans, to human problems, to helping solve and help people's problems, helping solve and resolve or improve upon society's challenges and ills in the way that I wanted to. And it was a somewhat interesting realization, in the sense that physics and astronomy is obviously very much about the real world, but a lot of the space in physics now is focused on smaller and smaller aspects of matter and understanding them, and a lot of astronomy is focused on things that are further and further away. And both of those I find very engaging pursuits, but although they're about the natural world, they're not about the real world in another instantiation of how we understand that term.
I couldn't help but think of the pun "down to earth" when you say that.
Say that again?
You're more of a down-to-earth kind of guy.
Right, there you go. Right, it's good fun. But yeah, and so law is very much about the real world in another understanding of that phrase. And so I was excited about a career that would more directly address, as I said, people's issues and concerns. And also I appreciated the variety of career opportunities that a law degree would present. When I went to law school, I was not quite sure about what career path I was going to take. Whether something in practice, potentially in a firm, potentially in a nonprofit organization, something in government, something in-house. Academia was certainly one possibility, I think, in the back of my mind, but not at all in the forefront. But the opportunity to sort of figure that out along the way, and there were a number of attractive potential careers that I was aware of, and so that's what led me to decide to shift gears a bit and go to law school.
And what did you take away from your years at Stanford?
I really enjoyed law school. I think that's part of the reason I ended up becoming a law faculty member. I felt that the experience opened my eyes a lot to understanding the world, how it functions, how people relate in it, how institutions relate in it. I referred before to the idea of law being a fundamental part of how we order society. I think that's a real understanding that I developed in law school. Given my science background, my interests focused around a couple fields that were very, heavily science oriented. And one was around law and technology, intellectual property law, and environmental law, and all of those involve some aspects of sort of the relation between law and science and technology. And that's what went on then to define my my career in academia as well.
And who was leading? First of all, was Stanford known for law and technology back then, and who was leading the program?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is at that time, not really, because no school was, I would say, really known for law and technology then, because the field wasn't quite recognized. When I went to law school, and would refer to an interest in law and technology or law and technology issues. And this was also the case after law school. And even when I began teaching in 2001. And so for a couple years in there, it wasn't unusual when I brought that up to get a quizzical stare from somebody, even somebody in academia or someone who was a lawyer or an attorney. And I'm wondering, well, what does that really mean? Or the question, I commonly got the question, well, does that mean intellectual property law? And my answer to that was always, well, intellectual property law can create law and technology issues, but it's looking more broadly at this question about how new technologies create new legal issues, new conflict, that the law either has to resolve or figure out what role it has to play in resolution. The central challenge in this space is what I often refer to as the timing challenge, which is new technologies are always developing much more quickly than any legal mechanism has a chance to respond. And in the face of that timing challenge and a lot of uncertainty, we have to figure out how to best provide an appropriate environment to promote innovation that can benefit to society while guarding against the downside risks that new technologies can present. And it spans such a remarkable array of potential benefits and risks, right? Ranging from human health concerns to and benefits and concerns to environmental benefits and concerns to constitutional and privacy kinds of questions. And so I really enjoyed addressing those all. And one of my areas of focus was on this question about whether there are generalizable rules, generalizable relationships, or lessons we can learn from one technology and the challenges with it that apply to another. Do we have to deal with every single new technology and the legal issues independently, or can we learn from the past?
And the answer to that question is?
The answer I have is that there are some lessons that can be learned. It certainly is contextual and not everything is always going to apply, but there are some answers that can be learned. But going back to that time, I was in law school in the 1990s, as I said, sort of entering academia in the early 2000s, and there started to be a handful of people who were focused on these kinds of questions and this law and technology space. And slowly that grew, and it eventually, I stopped getting those questions, and it became recognized as somewhat of a field. People understood what it was when we referred to it, and it's been very exciting to have my own academic career grow up around the development of a field that it's been a part of, and see that evolution, and then more and more scholars being drawn to these questions and exploring it, and so many, in fact, that it's now, we're back in a period where there tends to be less of a focus on law and technology as a field because, right, we have a whole area around privacy law, a whole area around cybersecurity, and other cyber issues. Obviously, IP continues to be an extremely robust and vibrant area of study, and so it's been interesting to watch this cycle of maturity that the field has gone through and how it's changed over time.
What would you say is the equivalent now? If somebody were to graduate today and they were doing something new in the law, what would the equivalent of what you did then be today?
Yeah, it's a very hard question to answer because I think there probably to some extent, are lots of proto fields that develop, if you will, but you can't always tell which ones are going to go through a large growth period and become something. And a lot of that depends on how, what happens with society and what role these kinds of issues take.
So you are a risk taker because you didn't know coming out if this was going to be the big field that it turned out to be.
No, that's half true in the sense that it was not a conscious risk taking. It was just driven by my own academic interest and the issues I like to explore. It certainly was a willingness to explore in that area and be part of it. But right, there certainly are no guarantees. I used to teach a course, a seminar on technology, science, and the law that focused on exactly what we've sort of been talking about. And I'd begin with a handful of 19th century technologies. We'd read some cases that had come up when steam boilers began to explode, when the telegraph began to be used and there were disputes over whether someone had or had not sent a certain telegraph, when barbed wire became prevalent. And we look at how judges reacted to these issues differently and how legislatures reacted to these issues differently. And and there are some lessons that can be drawn, and we chuckle at the innocence of, for instance, a judicial opinion that appears to rely heavily in a contract dispute on the fact that the telegraphs were made of copper, the telegraph wires were made of copper, which can't possibly be relevant. But then we sort of take those lessons and we carry it forward to some 20th century technologies. We look at some toxic tort kinds of issues, some end of life decisions, DNA, fingerprinting, and we sort of see how these more modern issues, some of the same challenges can be reflected in the 20th century as in the 19th. And then we look at 21st century issues that have not been resolved yet. And it's to introduce the students to the fact that a lot of this is unpredictable. And while we look at some of the 19th century and even 20th century approaches as quaint and seemingly not very sophisticated, we can see the same issues playing out today in some fields. And it's a real challenge to be trying to operate at the leading edge of technological development and have lawyers and judges try to operate in that space when they're not experts in the technology. So that's a challenge that continues. It's a long-winded story a little bit, but what I was going to talk about was in terms of predictability. You may be familiar with a law that was passed in the early 1980s called the Semiconductor Chip Protection Act. And this was passed after about 8 or 10 years of a lot of dispute, a lot of legislative activity, pressure, lobbying, tremendous amount of money spent on it because of a concern that there was a real need for semiconductor chip protection as a form of intellectual property in order to maintain incentives for companies to develop semiconductor chips. And that was, this was a real focus from the early 70s into the early 80s when the act was passed. But by the time the act was passed, it was essentially irrelevant because semiconductor chips had evolved to a point where other effective forms of intellectual asset protection, other than the need for this particular chip act, became available due to technological development. The technology had essentially outpaced the law. There was only one lawsuit ever litigated under the Semiconductor Chip Protection Act. So it can be very unpredictable what's going to become a field, become a legal issue, change in these regards, and we can all take our guesses. But
that is a great anecdote, and also I think it's very encouraging for viewers, especially if they are students from Temple and elsewhere, to think about their future careers. They don't necessarily have to be taking the well-trodden path because their provost didn't, and it didn't turn out that. But also, I think then as provost, when you look at potential courses and programs, you're coming from a prior which doesn't necessarily accept that whatever has been done before is the single best way to do it. And I think that's also important when we talk about leadership. But I'm now characterizing it for you. You can characterize it yourself and and respond to that.
Absolutely, no, I mean, and I couldn't have said it better myself. I think, you know, we're living through a period of tremendous change, socially, economically, politically, and certainly in higher education as well. It's a challenging time in higher education. The demographic in most of the country, the demographic reality is that there's a declining population of college age students. There's a lot of questioning going on in society about the value of higher education and whether colleges are returning the necessary value to students to make a degree worthwhile. We're obviously facing a lot of disruption due to COVID and continued effects from that on higher education, as well as a lot of, you know, social turmoil, economic challenges as well. So there's you know, there's a feeling of certainly getting buffeted from a few different sides. And it's interesting because in periods like this, my reaction is very much that, you know, that challenging periods also present opportunities and are precisely the time when we should take a look at what we're doing, questioning whether what we're doing continues to make sense in the current environment, and being willing to identify priorities and make changes as necessary in order to move the institution forward. It means making changes to improve the students' educational and learning opportunities, making changes to facilitate professors' research and interdisciplinary research, addressing the greatest societal challenges of the time. And so I'm sort of wired to think that way, and that may tie into some of the history we've discussed. It may tie into some of my academic exploration around technology and the law that we discussed. But it's not the only reaction that people have. Certainly some people have the reaction that in times of stress, we should sort of batten down the hatches and not make as many changes. But that's not the approach to leadership that I took either as dean of the law school or that I'm taking as provost. These are opportunities for us to really think about what are our highest priorities. What can we do to best support our faculty and our students in their pursuits, and how can we re-envision the higher education model so that it better serves those goals, and so that we stop having conversations about the value of higher ed because the value is so evident to folks involved from all directions that it doesn't get questioned in the same way.
And I mean, you talked about a number of different strands of very interesting topics. One of them is in interdisciplinary research, and it seems that so much today requires us to think in that way. Faculty, however, are used to thinking in silos. In fact, the higher up you go, the more you think about less and less. And so it's almost counterintuitive for them to break out that more. Of course, as provost, now that one of your challenges, in fact, is to encourage, I imagine, that type of collaboration. So why don't we start there and talk about how you are doing that, where you are at Temple?
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely put your finger on a problem and a challenge. I mean, it's almost a cliche to refer to universities as siloed, and it is a challenge that we face. And what I see when I think about our role in society, universities' role in society, if you consider, for example, the careers that students are interested in, or you consider the research that faculty do to address society's problems, both of those spaces require an interdisciplinary approach. Most of the careers that students want to go into the ways they want their mind to be expanded so that they will be successful in those careers are not single discipline careers, right? There aren't that many single discipline careers, so to speak, anymore. The same thing is true about faculty research. If you think about the largest problems facing society today, the ones that faculty are directing their energy and their efforts in order to resolve, many of them, most of them, are not so-called single discipline problems. They're problems that involve needing pieces from across.
Let me ask you something here,
yeah.
because Singapore has actually launched recently a new department within their university that focuses not on subject, but on subject matter. So AI, for example, you have an entire department and you bring different people from different departments and they all are in this new setup where they are not thinking about it in disciplinary silos, but really focused on subject matter. Is that the direction you see education headed?
Absolutely, and I think it's critical. And I think AI and data science are a perfect example, and one that I'm very focused on, and we're interested in exploring. Right, and they're at Temple now, as at many universities, there are folks in the business school who have a lot of expertise and are focused in research in machine learning and data science. There are folks in the College of Science and Technology, both in computer science, but also in biology and other disciplines that are focused on a lot of big data questions and using AI. There are folks in the health system, there are folks in psychology and neuroscience, and all of them are working in this AI data science space. And so one thing I want to do is bring them together, both for programmatic opportunities for students, but also for the research that can be done. Other examples that sit at the forefront of my mind are certainly around sustainability and addressing climate change, which requires understanding from a wide swath of disciplines that traditionally have been across different schools and colleges at a university, and wanting to bring those together. Innovation studies, something close to my heart. One of the, one of the other areas of focus I had in academics was how the law promotes innovation and creativity. And I studied that from a legal perspective, but many people study that from a business perspective. Psychologists study that from a psychological perspective as well. And so thinking about innovation and creativity. One of our Temple's president's main areas of focus is on the future of work and how higher education should be addressing that kind of future. That's another very interdisciplinary study, bringing together folks from the education school and the business school and certainly engineering and other disciplines. So a number of universities, not many, but a number have started to re-envision a little bit what model we use so that we can build across silos and bridge them all together. And you often hear the phrase breaking down silos. The goal isn't to break down an academic discipline, but figure out better how it bridges with other areas where we can find connections for people to work together in those regards. And so as we've been developing a strategic plan at Temple, that's very much something that's at the front of my mind.
And what would you say is Temple's comparative advantage in this? And does its role, its place in Philadelphia have anything to do with it?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and certainly something we focus on, and there are a couple spaces there. I'll begin with another area of important area of interdisciplinary study, which is urban studies, which is a critical field for understanding how our cities are developing and evolving, especially as more and more people move to them, for understanding the crime and violence prevention efforts that are should be taking place, need to be taking place as we see an increase in crime in different cities, and this is another area where it requires inputs and insights from various disciplines. So that's a particular area of expertise at Temple, and certainly a competitive advantage. One of the things that brought me to Temple, and one of the reasons I'm doing this job now, is that Temple, since its founding in the late 19th century, has had a very strong commitment to making higher education more accessible to a more diverse student body. And that spoke to me a lot when I was deciding sort of what law school to be a part of. And as I said, was a central part of my decision to become provost, creating new opportunities for students who might not otherwise have the chance to receive a college education or receive as strong a college education, to prepare them for career opportunities, for playing a role in society, and then for reshaping the face of various professions with those new college graduates. I'm thrilled to be at a place that provides extraordinary education for students that's affordable and accessible, and we have an extremely diverse student body. Over half of our first year class this year are students of color. Over a third are students who are first generation. And so it's very exciting to be a part of that. That mission is special, and then we see that reflected in our alums' feeling about the university and their commitment to it. Is a piece that really stands out. I've worked with a number of folks in alumni relations, both at the law school and at the university, who've been in a number of schools and universally refer to how strong the alumni feeling is at Temple. So that's special to be a part of. Another piece that we haven't touched on too much, in addition to some of these pieces around mission and the diversity and access that we provide to our student body, the urban studies, is also how strong our international programs are. We were one of the first schools to develop a study away program in Europe at our Rome campus. We were one of the first American schools to develop a program in Japan. We have a very vibrant campus in Tokyo, as well as a number of, those are university-wide programs, as well as a number of programs, school-specific programs in everywhere from Beijing to Jamaica, across other parts of Europe, Latin America, Africa. And so our students can, acquire a real global education. I think it helps advance the research that our faculty is doing to have those connections. So there's a lot of sort of sectors and spaces there.
And you yourself were involved in at least a number of them in cadets and in other places. Now, can you reflect and share with us those reflections about your own journey and takeaways from your time as faculty member to associate dean of research to interim dean, and then where you are now as provost?
Yeah, absolutely. I had the pleasure through some visiting opportunities and or research leaves to teach at various points for a little while at the University of Paris, at one of their campuses, at Christchurch University in New Zealand, and to be a visiting faculty member at in Cadiz, as you mentioned, in southern Spain.
Canterbury.
What's that?
At Canterbury.
Canterbury in New Zealand. I often think that it's by learning and understanding a bit of foreign culture, a foreign field, in these cases, understanding a foreign legal system, that it not only opens our mind in a number of ways, it helps us better understand our own culture and, for example, legal system better than we did before. It's by seeing how different societies or communities have developed alternate sets of laws, alternate sets of ways of approaching a discipline, is really a very mind-opening experience. I always encourage students to take a semester to study abroad, whether it was while I was dean of the law school or now. And the enthusiasm that most of them have when they have this opportunity. I was just over at Temple's Rome campus about a month ago, and so I met with the students and the faculty there. And the students just were mid-semester and finding it one of their most eye-opening experiences. It was many students who had never traveled outside the U.S. or may not have ever traveled far outside of Philadelphia in some cases. And meeting with alums, many of them who did our TU Rome or TU Japan program, look back at it as one of their most formative experiences during their educational period. So I think there's tremendous value there.
And that's certainly true for me. I would not have been in IP, but for the fact that I did that study abroad in Stockholm University years ago. Yeah. How do you make it affordable for students to do that?
Yeah, it's this is a tremendous challenge. In some ways, it's not entirely different from the general challenge we have around affordability for our students. We take a lot of effort. We make a lot of effort to keep costs low. We do that, I would say, in two primary ways. One is running a tight ship. So the reality is that students who come to Temple will get an exceptional education. There may not be quite as many fancy bells and whistles, but most of our students recognize that the trade-off for that is getting a high quality but lower cost education, and therefore they have less debt at graduation, and that redounds to their benefit throughout their careers and through their lives. And the second way is, of course, through other avenues of financial support, particularly from the generosity of alumni to help build our endowment. We have a significant set of endowment and support for scholarships and for other needs of the university. We're always looking, we always need to build that more and receive more outside funding. One of the chief barriers to students attending college and certainly to having these kind of international opportunities as well is financial cost. And so we work very hard to try.
I hope a potential sponsor hears this and gives you a call.
Right. Hopefully someone will hear this and want to support what we're doing. And sometimes those kinds of wonderful experiences happen.
And so in terms of your career, which has been extraordinary, and by the way, we talk about value-added institutions, Temple has always come to my mind as a fine school. And I was pleased to have been able to visit at Temple when I was in Philadelphia and with you during that trip. So thank you for your hospitality. You have been through the law school and you have led the law school. And reflecting on your leadership challenges and opportunities there, what would you say was your main takeaway?
From the main takeaway from being dean of the law school,
yes,
and coming to this role, it's a very different form of leadership being provost of the university versus being dean of the law school. When I became dean of Temple Law School, I had been in legal. I had been to law school. I had practiced law. I had been a law professor for over a decade, and at Temple itself for 9 years. And so I knew law well, I knew the discipline well, and I knew the specific law school well. And so although there were many challenges to the transition into becoming the dean, I was still able to understand the various aspects of the law school. If there was a piece that I didn't know about, someone could come and explain it to me, and within 5 minutes I would understand it, and then we could have a discussion about the particular issue. I was a little bit surprised when I became dean that there were areas of the law school I didn't really realize existed yet, but I learned about those. So I think that that was a particular form of leadership that involved a strong knowledge base. In my current role, we have 17 schools and colleges at the university that include, obviously not only the law school, it include includes other professional schools like the med school and dentistry and pharmacy, as well as a wide variety of undergraduate schools that range from sort of more traditional and common fields of study, like a college for liberal arts and a college of science and technology, to the education school, engineering, college of public health. And so there are many fields there, obviously, where I don't have the same background, don't have the same expertise, and yet still have to make decisions about what our strategy and what our approach is there. The importance of hiring good leaders to head up those areas is becomes even more important. Understanding how to delegate and how to focus on the issues that need to get up to speed on them quickly, and be able to resolve them becomes even more important. One piece I have also enjoyed is not just the breadth of the academic units, but also the other variety of administrative parts that report to me, including our global Office of Global Engagement for International Research, Information Technology, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, And so there's a lot of spaces where I can have an impact on the university, on students' lives, on the faculty's lives, and that it's very rewarding to be in this kind of a role.
Thank you. And, just speaking to the people that know you over there, I think they are very blessed and appreciative of what you do. As we draw the interview to a close, I did want to ask you, and this is sometimes overlooked given the importance of the positions that you've held, is that they also tend to be other lonely positions. You sort of go up the pyramid and you're just one. How can your colleagues, how can we generally, as a community of academics and stakeholders, support folks like you in your positions to help you to succeed in what you do and to make it meaningful too?
That's a very, it's a very generous question, and it is true. It can the old cliche, right? It can get lonely. The biggest piece I would say to answer, it's a great question, is something I do try to do, which is encourage faculty and deans to think broadly about the university. And so we do all have a tendency, and I had this as a faculty member, I had this as a dean, we do all have a tendency to focus on our particular school or college. That's the university we live in. It affects our daily lives to the greatest extent. But I encourage all of my colleagues, both faculty members and staff across Temple, and do this with other folks as well, to really try to think about how the whole university comes together. And what are the most important decisions to make for the good of the university, the future of the university, as opposed to what's something that's very individual school focused. I don't want to say selfish. It's not a problem with people being selfish, but it is people tend to have more of a focus on those aspects that impact them most immediately, as opposed to trying to think big picture. And I can definitely use some help in thinking big picture. There are a lot, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of challenges facing higher education. And as we chart an exciting course forward for Temple, we try very hard to have a lot of stakeholders involved, a lot of different minds involved to get as many good ideas as we can.
And I hope people watching this will start to knock on your door and say, hey, I've got a great idea. How can I help?
I'll check. I look forward to checking the email this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating fireside chat. Lots to think about and lots to be inspired for. Temple Provost Greg Mandel, thank you.